My father left me $2 million. My stepmother forged the will. I hired an investigator to prove the fraud. She got 7 years in prison. Her attorney brother was dead. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. My full and true name is Helena Carvalho Mendez. I'm 38 years old with an existence deeply marked by recent devastating loss, immediately followed by shocking family betrayal that transformed expected natural grief into an incomprehensible, Kafkaesque nightmare. And I'm an independent architect specializing in high-end residential projects, working intensely, obsessively during the last 12 years, building a respectable independent career through tireless dedication and almost pathological perfectionism genetically inherited from my admired father, who died suddenly, unexpectedly, devastatingly, just 7 months and 19 days ago from a massive fatal heart attack at 64 years old while playing doubles tennis with retired friends on a sunny, ordinary Saturday morning that should have been routine but became a catastrophic watershed, irreversibly separating the relatively stable previous life from the current chaotic existence. Dad Antônio Carvalho Mendes was a brilliant retired civil engineer who literally built dozens of iconic commercial and residential buildings in our city over 42 years of exemplary, impeccable career. An upright man, universally respected by professional colleagues and deeply admired by family, he always consistently prioritized above tempting corporate ambitions. Sole proprietor of a lucrative technical consulting firm established after early retirement at 58, when he decided to reduce the frenetic work pace to enjoy more time with his beloved family and hobbies neglected during decades of consuming professional dedication. The absolutely surreal, devastating, infuriating, and ultimately transformative story I'll now narrate with every painful detail permanently etched in traumatized memory began on an apparently tranquil, ordinary rainy Tuesday afternoon when I received an unexpected, confusing, unsettling phone call from Deborah Costa Mendes. The stepmother, my father, had married precipitously, impulsively, just 3.5 years earlier after meeting her at an expensive gym frequented by wealthy retirees trying to maintain physical conditioning against inevitable aging. A woman 40 years younger than him who always caused me inexplicable, instinctive discomfort, although I could never precisely articulate objective reasons for that visceral antipathy beyond a persistent feeling that there was something fundamentally false, calculated, artificial in every excessively affectionate gesture she directed toward Dad. Deborah called, crying hysterically, dramatically at exactly 2:27 p.m. while I was reviewing complex architectural plans in my quiet home office. Her shrill, high-pitched voice cutting through the phone line like an electric saw, lacerating already tense nerves from professional pressure of a delayed project with a demanding, impatient client. Helena, my love, something terrible, devastating has happened. Your father, Antonio, my beloved husband, had a sudden heart attack during a tennis match. The ambulance arrived quickly, but it was too late. Doctors tried extensively to resuscitate, but he died before reaching the hospital. I'm completely destroyed, desperate. I don't know what to do. I need you urgently here at the hospital right now, immediately. The words penetrated consciousness slowly, viscously like thick honey passing through a fine sieve. My brain initially refusing to process the obvious devastating meaning because acceptance would imply confronting the unbearable reality that my apparently invincible immortal father had really just died suddenly at 64 when he should reasonably have lived another 20 or 30 healthy years enjoying well-deserved retirement after decades of dedicated hard work. Vindication that seemed impossible to process emotionally at that traumatic moment of raw, fresh grief, overwhelming rational, analytical thinking completely. I dropped the architectural plans scattered chaotically across my work table, grabbed my car keys with uncontrollably trembling hands, drove in a dissociative shock state through congested urban streets, barely registering red lights or pedestrians crossing, tears beginning to flow uncontrollably, blurring vision dangerously, but unable to stop driving because of the urgent need to see. Dad visually confirmed the incomprehensible reality, perhaps discovered there was a grotesque medical error, hospital administrative confusion, unlikely miracle reversing the definitive terminal diagnosis. I parked illegally in a space reserved for medical emergencies, receiving disapproving looks from uniformed security guards, but ignoring them completely because civilized social protocols seemed irrelevant, absurd in the face of personal apocalypse collapsing catastrophically. Deborah waited dramatically, theatrically in the sterile, cold hallway of the emergency room, makeup grotesquely smeared by apparently genuine tears, although retrospectively I strongly suspect they were artificially manufactured using known amateur actress techniques. She was wearing expensive, imported brand gym clothes that seemed inappropriate for the solemn occasion of her spouse's sudden death, embracing me tightly when she saw me approaching, staggering like a disoriented zombie crossing unknown threatening territory. Helena dear, it was so quick. Sudden. He was laughing, playing normally the moment before, then simply collapsed on the court floor. His friends immediately called emergency services, but paramedics said he probably died instantly in the first minute because the heart attack was massive, completely blocking the main coronary artery. She sobbed convulsively against my shoulder while I remained rigidly immobile, unable to return the embrace or offer comforting words because my own paralyzing shock consumed all available emotional capacity. A young attending physician with the perpetually tired appearance of someone working regular double, triple shifts eventually appeared, confirming clinically, professionally, impersonally, what Deborah had dramatically reported. Antonio Carvalho Mendes, 64 years old, deceased at 1:42 p.m. from massive acute myocardial infarction. Prolonged cardiopulmonary resuscitation efforts for 28 minutes were unsuccessful. Preliminary cause of death subject to mandatory protocol autopsy confirmation, but essentially conclusive based on clear, unequivocal clinical presentation. My sister Patricia, 3 years older, coincidentally working a cardiology shift in the same hospital complex, although in a different building, arrived running uncontrollably 15 minutes after receiving the devastating news through a medical colleague who recognized the familiar surname in emergency admission documentation. Her impeccable white hospital uniform cruelly contrasting with a face destroyed by tears flowing copiously without any attempt to maintain her habitual professional composure because the loss was personal, familial, transcending distanced clinical medical protocols. Patricia embraced me for a long time, silently, just holding firmly while we both cried uncontrollably for the first time jointly. Since we were small children consoling each other after frightening nightmares, deep fraternal connection automatically activated by shared tragedy. Deborah watched our fraternal embrace with a strange, indefinable expression I couldn't precisely interpret in that traumatized moment, but retrospectively recall as possibly containing an element of poorly disguised, irritated impatience or cold strategic calculation, assessing how our fraternal unity might affect future plans not yet publicly revealed. The subsequent days passed nebulously, unreally, surrealistically in a confused succession of traditional funerary rituals, automatically executed following culturally established social protocols. Prolonged nighttime wake in a chapel morbidly decorated with excessive white flowers and flickering votive candles surrounding a closed mahogany casket because Deborah insisted hysterically that the body shouldn't be displayed too. Preserve his memory as he was alive and healthy instead of a pale, disfigured corpse. Solemn Catholic Mass celebrated by a monotonous elderly priest who clearly didn't personally know. Dad reciting generic, comforting platitudes about eternal celestial life. Rainy, melancholy burial in an old municipal cemetery where paternal grandparents already rested for decades awaiting inevitable family reunion. Deborah masterfully performed the role of inconsolable grieving widow during all public ceremonies, sobbing dramatically, theatrically collapsing, needing constant physical support from equally artificial, superficial friends who mysteriously appeared offering rehearsed emotional support, wearing appropriate expensive black dresses but completely inappropriate flashy gold accessories revealing poorly disguised fundamental materialistic priorities beneath a thin, civilized veneer. 1 week and 3 days after the definitive burial, when the initial acute pain was beginning to slowly transform into more manageable chronic, persistent sadness, although not fundamentally less devastating, Deborah convened an urgent family meeting at the luxurious apartment she shared with Dad, located in an exclusive vertical condominium where residents were predominantly wealthy retirees and successful businessmen, alleging the need to discuss pending estate matters and reading of the will left by Antonio. Patricia and I attended punctually at the scheduled time, 6 p.m. Tuesday, finding Deborah seated majestically on an expensive Italian genuine leather sofa that Dad had reluctantly purchased after she insisted for months that the previous furniture was embarrassingly antiquated, inadequate for their residential standard. Surprisingly, unexpectedly accompanied by an unknown man who introduced himself formally but coldly as Claudio Costa, her older brother, an established criminal defense attorney, although we had never heard Deborah mention his existence previously during the 3.5 years we superficially knew her. Claudio was an immediately, instinctively unpleasant man for indefinable reasons that make certain people inspire instant visceral distrust regardless of objective, concrete evidence. arrogantly, excessively confident body posture, insincere, oily smile that never reached his slightly crossed eyes, deliberately too strong handshake attempting to establish unnecessary physical dominance, expensive custom-tailored suit that seemed incongruously pretentious considering the somber occasion of posthumous estate discussion. Miss Helena and Patricia, I deeply lament the devastating loss of Mr. Antonio, who, although I knew briefly for a short period, left a striking impression. As an upright, admirable man, he began with a professionally practiced, unctuous voice, sounding absolutely false, artificial to my instinctively distrustful ears, dramatically gesturing with a worn leather briefcase containing documents that presumably included the anxiously awaited paternal will. As family attorney and designated legal representative of Mrs. Deborah in this difficult moment of estate transition, I have the formal legal responsibility to communicate the final testamentary provisions established by the deceased Mr. Antonio Carvalho Mendez in a document dated, signed, notarized exactly 1 year and 8 months ago. He paused dramatically, unnecessarily for calculated theatrical effect, before continuing with a falsely solemn tone that barely disguised poorly contained underlying satisfaction. According to the last testamentary will explicitly expressed in an unquestionable legal document, Mr. Antonio designated his beloved wife, Deborah Costa Mendez, as principal universal beneficiary, inheriting the totality of accumulated liquid assets conservatively, estimated at approximately $2 million, including the current residential apartment valued at $800,000, technical consulting company valued at $700,000, diversified financial investments totaling $400,000, and other various assets making up the remaining balance. To his biological daughters, Helena and Patricia, the testator left significant sentimental mementos, specifically a gold wristwatch belonging to his paternal grandfather and a collection of technical engineering books accumulated during his career, in addition to symbolic monetary values of $5,000 each intended for purchasing significant personal keepsake, lovingly preserving paternal memory. The words fell on me like a thermonuclear bomb, detonating silently, completely destroying any remaining notion of comprehensible logical reality. $5,000, grandfather's watch, dusty books, while the stepmother married precipitously just 3.5 years ago, inherited literally $2 million that dad patiently accumulated during 42 years of dedicated hard work. I looked incredulously at Patricia, whose normally serene, professionally controlled face had transformed into a mask of absolute shock, disbelief, identical to what I felt internally, mouth partially open, silently articulating words that couldn't form coherent, audible sounds. Deborah observed our reactions with a carefully studied, neutral expression, but I briefly detected a fleeting flash of triumphant satisfaction crossing her facial features before quickly reassuming the appropriately sad, grieving widow mask for the solemn circumstance. This is absolutely impossible, ridiculous, completely out of character for our father, who always valued family above everything and would never leave his biological daughters practically disinherited, favoring a recent wife he knew only a tiny fraction of his life. Patricia finally managed to articulate with a trembling voice, controlling growing anger through years of medical training, maintaining professional composure before extreme, stressful situations. Dad talked to me explicitly 6 months ago during a family dinner, specifically mentioning he had updated his will, ensuring that Helena and I would receive substantial equal parts of his estate to guarantee our future financial security independent of our respective professional successes. I demand to see the original testamentary document immediately and verify the authenticity of signatures witnesses. Independent notarial acknowledgement. Claudio smiled condescendingly, paternalistically, like a patient adult explaining simple concepts to stubborn, irrational children. Opening the briefcase, extracting a thick document stapled multiple pages of dense, incomprehensible legal text covered with apparently authentic, legitimate, colorful official stamps. I completely understand the natural emotional reaction to unexpected testamentary provisions contradicting preconceived expectations based on previous informal conversations, he said with an irritatingly condescending, rehearsed professional tone. However, the legal documentation present here was duly registered, authenticated, notarized at a respectable notary office, established decades in the city, strictly complying with all necessary legal protocols established by current Brazilian civil code. Witness signatures were provided by 2 upstanding witnesses without direct family ties as legally required. Authentic signature acknowledgement was executed by a licensed notary, personally verifying the testator's identity using valid official documentation. Obviously, the young ladies have an incontestable legal right to judicially contest the will if they believe there exists irregularities or the testator's mental capacity was compromised at the moment of document elaboration. But I must honestly advise, based on 27 years of professional experience, that successful testamentary contestations are statistically rare, exceptional, requiring substantial convincing evidence demonstrating unequivocal fraud or documentally proven coercion. We left that luxurious apartment where we grew up regularly visiting Dad after his divorce from our mother decades ago in a state of profound traumatized shock, driving silently through urban streets artificially illuminated by blinking commercial neon lights, while our brains slowly, painfully processed the devastating implications of what we had just surrealistically heard. Patricia broke the heavy, oppressive silence finally when we parked in front of my modest middle-class suburban apartment. "Helena, something is fundamentally, obviously wrong with that supposedly legitimate will. I've known Dad intimately for 41 entire years, and he would never, absolutely never, disinherit his beloved biological daughters, leaving practically everything to a recent wife he knew for a tiny fraction of his life. We need to investigate thoroughly. Hire a specialized inheritance law attorney immediately. Demand independent expert verification of that document's authenticity, because my professional medical instinct trained for decades. Identifying subtle anomalies is screaming loudly that we were deliberately, systematically deceived by unscrupulous people exploiting his recent death when we're emotionally vulnerable, unable to think clearly, rationally." I agreed immediately, viscerally, because even through the fog of persistent grief pain, I felt instinctively, undeniably, that we had been victims of an elaborately, meticulously planned fraud, coldly executed, taking advantage of temporal vulnerability at a critical moment when we were psychologically least able to resist, effectively, or question aggressively. That sleepless night, lying awake in the dark bed, listening to nighttime urban sounds filtering through half-open windows, I made a crucial, definitive, transformative decision that would completely change the subsequent trajectory of this devastating story. I would not passively, resignedly, silently accept the role of helpless victim unjustly stripped by an opportunistic scammer exploiting my beloved father's death for immoral personal enrichment. I would fight strategically, intelligently, relentlessly to expose the presumed fraud, recovering not just the stolen estate, but primarily the honor of paternal memory cruelly violated by unscrupulous people devoid of basic conscience, fundamental human decency. The next morning, an ironically beautiful sunny Wednesday, cruelly contrasting with the turbulent interior emotional storm, I systematically, methodically began an investigative campaign, starting with extensive online research identifying attorneys specializing in inheritance law with established solid reputations and verifiable success rates in complex, aggressively disputed testamentary contestations. The name that appeared repeatedly, consistently, in specialized legal forums and reliable professional recommendations was Dr. Augusto Ferreira, a 54-year-old civil lawyer with 3 decades of accumulated experience representing families in estate disputes involving document fraud, undue influence, testator mental incapacity, established in a modest but respectable office in the city's historic center. I called immediately, urgently requesting an emergency consultation, briefly explaining the surreal, impossible situation. An efficient, compassionate secretary, recognizing the genuine urgency, scheduled a meeting for that same afternoon at 4 p.m. Dr. Augusto was an impressively imposing man with commanding presence despite medium stature. Gleaming black skin under the office's artificial illumination, organized meticulously, graying beard trimmed with millimetric precision, framing an expressive face marked by deep wrinkles of constant concentration, critical thinking. His penetrating dark brown eyes seemed to instantly catalog every emotional, nuanced facial expression, while Patricia and I detailed chronologically the complete story from Dad's sudden death to the shocking revelation of testamentary provisions, completely incongruent with his known character, solidly established during decades of close, loving family relationship. He listened attentively, patiently, silently, for a full 53 minutes without interrupting once, only occasionally nodding understandingly and noting cryptic observations in a worn leather notebook using an elegant anachronistic old fountain pen from the current digital era. Miss Helena and Patricia, based exclusively on the detailed verbal account provided without yet physically examining the original testamentary documentation. I immediately identify multiple red alarm signals, strongly suggestive indicators of possible elaborate systematic testamentary fraud. He finally began after I concluded the emotional narrative, interrupted by occasional involuntary sobs, remembering particularly painful moments. First and most obvious, drastic alteration of estate provisions, disproportionately favoring a recent spouse to the detriment of biological daughters represents a statistically anomalous behavioral deviation, especially considering you describe a historically close, loving father-daughter relationship without significant conflicts, justifying punitive Second, suspiciously convenient timing of testamentary elaboration, supposedly occurring 1 year and 8 months preceding death, temporally coinciding with the period when, according to your report, your father was demonstrating subtle initial signs of mild cognitive decline, possibly related to early stages of clinically undiagnosed vascular dementia that could have compromised the critical judgment capacity necessary for substantial financial decisions of this consequential magnitude. Third, presence of the principal beneficiary's attorney brother acting as legal representative immediately after the testator's death, even before an appropriate mourning period elapsed, suggests coordinated prior planning, anticipating potential family contestation, needing legal defense prepared in advance. His words articulated clinically, analytically validated the visceral instincts we felt intensely but couldn't yet logically articulate. Through the emotional fog of persistent grief clouding objective critical reasoning, Patricia leaned forward anxiously. Hopefully, Dr. Augusto, being a cardiologist familiar with medical legal expert protocols, what would we specifically need to effectively contest this suspicious will and prove document fraud or undue influence exercised over a father when he was potentially cognitively vulnerable? And realistically speaking, based on your extensive professional experience, what are our objective chances of judicial success recovering the stolen estate? He breathed deeply, interlacing long fingers on the organized desk covered with piles of bulky, colorful, bound legal case files. We'll need to construct a robust, multifaceted case attacking multiple fronts simultaneously. First, independent expert graphological analysis comparing the testamentary signature with proven, authentic samples of your father collected from bank documents, professional contracts, verifiable dated personal correspondence establishing whether the signature was grossly falsified or skillfully replicated through sophisticated fraudulent techniques. Second, detailed private investigation tracking financial movements, telephone communications, medical records of your father during the critical period preceding testamentary elaboration, identifying potential evidence of psychological coercion, emotional manipulation, administration of psychoactive medications, altering critical judgment capacity. Third, location and interrogation of the testamentary witnesses supposedly present during document execution, verifying whether they really personally witnessed the signature or simply were bribed to falsify fraudulent testimonies through illicit financial compensation. He paused significantly before continuing with brutal professional honesty. As for success probabilities, I must be absolutely frank realistic. Testamentary contestations are legally challenging, temporally prolonged, often lasting 2 to 5 years, complete judicial processing, financially onerous, costing conservatively between $50,000 to $150,000 in attorney fees, case costs, technical expert evaluations depending on complexity and resistance encountered from the opposing party, and emotionally devastating, requiring repeatedly reliving painful details of the deceased's death through witness testimonies, public hearings, invasive procedures. Statistical success rate based on recent jurisprudence, approximately 40 to 55% in similar cases depending on robustness of presented evidence and advocacy skill of both sides. However, he raised an emphatic finger when multiple simultaneous indicators of coordinated fraud exist, as apparently exists in this specific case based on the initial account provided. Probabilities improve substantially to potentially 70 to 80% with diligent investigation, meticulous preparation, appropriately executed aggressive litigation strategy. Patricia and I exchanged prolonged, silent looks communicating volumes through fraternal connection, developed over decades, sharing fundamental formative experiences, tacitly agreeing without need for explicit words that we would proceed relentlessly, regardless of personal financial costs, extensive temporal duration, or inevitable emotional wear, because justice for violated paternal memory transcended selfish, convenient, practical considerations. Dr. Augusto, we want to hire your professional services immediately. Initiating formal contestation proceedings of this fraudulent will, in addition to simultaneously hiring a private investigator specialized in document fraud, meticulously tracking all available evidence proving our father was systematically, deliberately deceived by unscrupulous people, exploiting vulnerabilities at a critical moment in his life. I declared firmly, voice surprisingly stable considering the interior emotional turmoil. We realistically understand the substantial challenges involved financially, temporally, emotionally, but we're absolutely, unequivocally committed to seeking justice, not just recovering stolen estate, but primarily publicly exposing the fraud perpetrated, restoring paternal memory, honor cruelly stained by calculating opportunistic criminals. Dr. Augusto smiled approvingly, appreciatively for the first time during the serious meeting, expression transforming severe austere facial features into a momentarily paternal, encouraging that unwavering determination, resilient mentality committed regardless of foreseeable obstacles is precisely the necessary attitude in successful clients. Differently from those who prematurely abandon processes when the first inevitable difficulties arise discouragingly. I know an exceptional private investigator specialized in exactly the type of sophisticated document fraud we strongly suspect occurred. Ricardo Tavares, retired federal police forensic expert after 22 years of distinguished service where he developed incomparable expertise identifying document falsifications, tracking purposely obscured financial transactions, locating strategically disappeared reluctant witnesses. I've worked closely, collaboratively with Ricardo for approximately 15 years in multiple complex cases, achieving impressive success rates significantly superior to the civil law industry average. The subsequent days accelerated vertiginously in militarily coordinated frenetic activity, extensive initial meeting with Investigator. Ricardo at his discreet office located in a secondary commercial district revealed an intense, focused, professional man with penetrating gray eyes that seemed like X-rays, instantly detecting lies and discreet scars, suggesting a dangerous previous life directly confronting violent criminals before forced retirement for reasons never completely explained, but presumably involving significant physical, psychological trauma. Ricardo listened silently, attentively, while we repeated the already multiple times rehearsed narrative, occasionally interrupting to clarify specific chronological details or request additional information about potential witness contacts, immediately available supporting documentation, access to paternal bank accounts for tracking suspicious financial movements preceding his sudden death. Ricardo initiated investigation immediately, methodically, mercilessly through multiple strategically coordinated simultaneous fronts. First, he discreetly obtained through remaining federal police contacts access to complete telephone records of Deborah and Claudio during the critical 6-month period preceding Dad's death until 3 subsequent weeks, revealing a pattern of suspicious, intensified communication between siblings, including dozens of prolonged calls temporarily coinciding with specific dates mentioned in the supposedly authentic fraudulent will. Second, he meticulously tracked Deborah's financial transactions, discovering substantial bank transfers totaling $1,000 deposited in Claudio's checking account exactly 11 days after the supposed date of questionable testamentary elaboration. Payment clearly incompatible with her claims of being completely financially dependent on Dad for all monthly expenses, as she had dramatically repeatedly complained during forced, awkward family dinners that Patricia and I politely tolerated only out of filial love, respect. Third, he skillfully located through investigative techniques, not completely legal, but pragmatically necessary, the 2 witnesses supposedly present during testamentary execution, Marcos Antonio Silveira and Cristina Rodriguez Lopes, both retirees residing in the same luxurious vertical condominium as Deborah and Dad. Apparently respectable elderly people, but financially vulnerable, living exclusively on modest pension benefits insufficient to maintain the comfortable lifestyle standard desired by surrounding affluent residents, constantly reminding them of humiliating economic disparities. Ricardo scheduled separate individual interviews with both witnesses using a false pretext, alleging he was updating condominium registrations for building management, initially meeting with Mr. Marcos, who immediately nervously demonstrated classic behavioral signs of a person consciously concealing compromising information. Consistent, evasive eye contact, excessive facial perspiration, disproportionate to climatically controlled ambient temperature. Minor factual contradictions during supposedly simple, straightforward account of how he knew the deceased Antonio and circumstances under which he witnessed his testamentary signature. When Ricardo pressed gently, persistently, with detailed specific questions about exact date, precise time, physical location where supposed testamentary signature occurred, memorable environmental details of that significant moment, Mr. Marcos began perspiring profusely, stuttering incoherently, finally admitting, hesitantly, shamefully, that he never actually personally witnessed Antonio signing the document, having been approached subsequently by Deborah offering $5,000 generous financial compensation simply to sign a witness declaration falsely affirming he was present during testamentary execution, legitimizing the secretly elaborated fraudulent document. Mrs. Cristina revealed herself similarly, predictably vulnerable under Ricardo's skillful, persistent interrogation, confessing tearfully, regretfully, after only 22 minutes of strategically applied psychological pressure, that she also accepted an identical $5,000 financial bribe from Deborah following specific, detailed instructions from Claudio, meticulously coordinating the fraudulent operation from behind the scenes, carefully protecting himself from direct personal legal exposure, maintaining plausible, deniable distance in case the scheme was eventually discovered by investigative authorities or suspicious family members contesting implausible testamentary provisions. Armed with confessions recorded audio-visually discreetly through minuscule electronic devices, strategically hidden in Ricardo's clothing as legally permitted in specific, legitimate investigative situations. According to liberal complex interpretations of Brazilian criminal procedural legislation that attorney Augusto assured us would be judicially admissible despite inevitable technical questioning from adversary defense, we formally requested independent expert graphological analysis conducted by nationally renowned judicial expert Dr. Fernanda Campos, specializing in document falsification identification with 31 years of accumulated experience. Dr. Fernanda examined minutely, microscopically, for 11 intensive laboratory days, the questionable testamentary signature systematically, comparing with 17 independently verified authentic samples of paternal handwriting collected from notarially archived professional contracts, postally dated personal correspondence, bank checks processed by financial institutions established for decades, official government documents permanently archived in public offices, concluding definitively, unequivocally in a detailed technical report of 53 dense pages of specialized scientific terminology that the testamentary signature was a gross falsification incompetently executed by a right-handed individual attempting to manually replicate the natural fluid cursive signature of a left-handed person, as Dad was notorious. Specifically, the expert report precisely identified 8 critical, incontestable graphological inconsistencies. Excessively uniform pen pressure, applied contrasting natural variations expected in authentic spontaneous writing, individual letter inclination angles systematically deviating from patterns established in authentic comparative samples, microscopic hesitations visible at connection points between adjacent letters indicating careful deliberate reproduction instead of unconscious automatic fluidity characteristic of genuine habitual signatures, minuscule tremors detectable under advanced magnification, suggesting nervous tension, guilty conscience of inexperienced forger, inadequately technically prepared executing document crime for the first time. Additionally, sophisticated chemical analysis of the ink used in the testamentary document revealed molecular composition inconsistent with the specific brand of fountain pens Dad exclusively used during the last 2 decades of life, as confirmed by multiple independent witnesses, including his administrative secretary, who worked at the consulting company for 17 years, intimately knowing his daily habits, personal preferences, including his peculiar obsession with a specific brand of expensive annually imported German pens through an exclusive specialized supplier because he alleged that superior ink quality, exceptional writing tip fluidity amply justified the disproportionately elevated substantial financial investment compared to commercially available conventional alternatives. Dr. Augusto meticulously compiled, strategically organized all incriminating evidence, laboriously collected during 4 months of intensive, uninterrupted investigation, formally presenting an initial petition for testamentary contestation before the Specialized Family and Estates Court of the State Justice Tribunal, annexing voluminous supporting documentation, recorded confessions of bride witnesses admitting conscious participation in document fraud through illicit financial compensation, conclusive graphological expert report demonstrating testamentary signature falsification, telephone records demonstrating suspicious coordination between Deborah and Claudio during the critical period, bank statements revealing financial transfers incompatible with her alleged economic dependence. Presiding Judge Renata Fonseca Almeida, a nationally respected magistrate for technically impeccable, legally solidly grounded, and humanly compassionate, sentences recognizing emotional dimensions of family disputes transcending purely legalistic bureaucratic procedural coldness, immediately provisionally determined complete judicial blocking of all questioned estate, preventing Deborah from alienating, transferring, mortgaging, or wastefully spending any fraudulently inherited assets until definitive resolution of the procedural merit through final res judicata sentence. An extraordinarily favorable preliminary injunction, reflecting judicial preliminary impression, strongly inclined, favoring our robustly grounded allegations. Claudio reacted predictably, desperately, with aggressive judicial contestation, presenting technically sophisticated but fundamentally, substantively empty legal counterarguments, attempting to disqualify presented evidence, alleging imaginary procedural vices, testimonial incompetence of confessing bribed people, alleged expert bias based on absurd conspiracy theories suggesting we had financially corrupted Dr. Fernanda through substantial secret payments, artificially fabricating scientific conclusions, favorably favoring our litigious position. Creative, desperate legal argumentations revealing underlying guilty consciousness that their case was inexorably crumbling under the weight of systematically accumulated, incontestable, objective evidence. During 5 subsequent emotionally anguishing, physically exhausting months, transpired multiple judicial hearings where Patricia and I testified at length, in detail, about our historical relationship with Dad, solidly establishing his character and that he would deliberately disinherit his beloved biological daughters, favoring a superficially known recent spouse. Aggressive confrontational interrogations conducted by Claudio, attempting to psychologically destabilize through hostile, insinuating questions suggesting impure, selfish financial motives for testamentary contestation, instead of genuine search for paternal justice. Technical expert testimonies from Dr. Fanena patiently pedagogically explaining to Judge Renata the graphological scientific methodologies employed in document analysis, enlighteningly responding to skeptical questioning from adversary defense, attempting to professionally discredit her. The most dramatic, cinematic, emotionally cathartic moments of the judicial process occurred when Ricardo personally presented before the tribunal the audio-visually recorded confessions of Mr. Marcos and Mrs. Cristina, publicly reproduced through modern multimedia equipment temporarily installed in the hearing room, especially for the transcendental occasion. The trembling, repentant voices of the bribed witnesses echoing acoustically through the absolutely silent chamber while admitting conscious voluntary participation in elaborately systematically coordinated document fraud by Deborah and Claudio, exploiting Dad's cognitive vulnerability during the final period of life when he presented subtle initial signs of clinically undiagnosed but retrospectively behaviorally observable mental decline. Deborah watched the incriminating audio-visual projection, with facial expression progressively disintegrating from the innocent, unjustly victimized grieving widow, masked gradual guilty recognition of inevitable complete collapse of the planned, coldly, calculatedly executed fraudulent scheme during months of anticipatory preparation, opportunistically taking advantage of his initial illness to financially manipulate a state, positioning exclusively favoring her selfish interests through grossly incompetently executed falsified documentation by Claudio, who clearly, arrogantly overestimated his own criminal abilities, dangerously underestimating our investigative determination and capacity to mobilize specialized professional resources to unmask the sophisticatedly coordinated fraudulent operation. After concentrated deliberation of precisely chronometered 47 minutes during suspension recess of the conclusive final hearing, Judge Renata returned to the tribunal, formally announcing the definitive judicial decision with firm, authoritative voice impressively reverberating through the hearing room packed with curious spectators, including local journalists covering the case that had gradually attracted growing media attention due to the dramatic narrative elements involving family betrayal, document falsification, financially exploited vulnerable elderly. The contested will was declared judicially absolutely null due to insanely irreparable document fraud, vice unequivocally proven through irrefutable scientific technical evidence complemented by corroborating testimonial confessions. The integral estate of Antonio Carvalho Mendes would be equitably redistributed, conforming to applicable Brazilian succession legislation for cases of valuable absence among necessary legitimate heirs. Biological daughters Helena and Patricia, each receiving equal half-parts of the totality of judicially evaluated estate assets, valued at $2,130,000, considering updated expert RIA. Additionally, the sentence determined that Deborah should fully reimburse all procedural costs, attorney fees, expert expenses totaling $183,000 plus an exemplary punitive fine of $50,000 destined for the Free Legal Assistance Fund, helping needy families without financial resources to hire private attorneys in similar succession disputes. Substantial financial penalty designed to discourage future testamentary fraud attempts by opportunistic scammers, observing the publicly established judicial precedent in this emblematic, widely media-reported case, establishing regionally dissuasive jurisprudence. However, dramatic twists didn't completely cease with the favorable sentence, because Judge Renata additionally determined that the document fraud evidence and confessional testimonies indicating conscious, deliberate participation in crimes typified in the Brazilian Penal Code should be formally forwarded to the state Public Prosecutor's Office for Preliminary Criminal Investigation, evaluating the merit of instituting criminal proceedings against Deborah and Claudio for crimes of ideological falsity, qualified fraud, public document falsification, with aggravating circumstances of exploiting vulnerability of an elderly victim presenting incipient cognitive decline as established by special protection legislation for vulnerable elderly people, dramatically expanding the potential consequences of the fraudulent scheme beyond merely losing the stolen estate to now include the real concrete possibility of imprisonment in the state penitentiary if criminal accusations were eventually judicially proven in a separate penal instance. The designated public prosecutor investigating the case preliminarily, Dr. Henrique Martins Costa, veteran jurist, specializing in white-collar crimes with fierce, implacable reputation, pursuing sophisticated financial criminals, attempting to escape legal accountability through legal technicalities or corrupting political influences. Promptly, energetically initiated formal police inquiry requisitioning state civil police to conduct additional complementary investigations expanding the original scope, exclusively focused on civil succession issues to encompass broader potential criminal penal dimensions, potentially revealing a systematic, repetitive, fraudulent behavioral pattern involving multiple previous victims similarly exploited by Deborah and Claudio, coordinately operating succession scams specifically targeting emotionally vulnerable, recently widowed, wealthy elderly men. Subsequent police investigations revealed shockingly, stunningly, that Dad wasn't Deborah's first victim, but rather the fourth, documentally identifiable. In a repetitive predatory pattern, progressively escalating financial ambition over 15 years of fraudulent operations. Previously, she had quickly strategically married a 72-year-old retired merchant who died suddenly under similar suspicious circumstances. 6 months after her marriage, inheriting an apartment valued at $300,000. Subsequently, she romantically involved herself with a 68-year-old retired businessman, also prematurely unexpectedly deceased, 11 months into her relationship, benefiting financially through substantial donations made before his death, totaling $200,000 transferred to her bank account supposedly to fund expensive alternative medical treatments never actually realized. The third identified victim was a 70-year-old retired physician deceased after 2 years of marriage, with her leaving a similarly questionable will, disproportionately favoring her over his biological children, who didn't judicially contest for unknown reasons. Possibly psychological intimidation or ignorance of legal contestation rights. Confronted with accumulated evidence of a systematic, repetitive criminal pattern coordinately operating with Claudio, always providing necessary technical legal assistance to elaborate superficially convincing but technically defective fraudulent documentations when rigorously examined by competent specialized experts, Deborah psychologically completely collapsed during formal police interrogation at the Specialized Financial Crimes Precinct. She confessed tearfully. In detail, the complete operational scheme progressively developed over a decade and a half systematically, targeting wealthy elderly men recently widowed or divorced, vulnerable, attending expensive exclusive gyms, elitist social clubs, luxury tourist cruises where travelers were predominantly wealthy retirees seeking romantic companionship to fill post-loss loneliness of spouses deceased after decades of stable relationships. Claudio initially tried, bravely resisting police interrogation, invoking constitutional rights to remain silent and consult criminal defense attorney before responding to any potentially self-incriminating questions, but eventually capitulated also under accumulated psychological pressure when confronted with irrefutable bank records, demonstrating regular substantial receipts transferred by Deborah, totaling $340,000 accumulated over 15 years of successive fraudulent operations, plus electronic communications, emails exchanged between siblings explicitly discussing psychological manipulation strategies of vulnerable elderly victims, progressively sophisticated document falsification techniques as they empirically learned operational errors committed in previous, less financially successful scams. The public prosecutor formally offered criminal indictment against both defendants before the Specialized Criminal Court for Complex Property Crimes, accusing Deborah of 4 crimes of qualified fraud through deception, 2 crimes of private document fraud, 1 crime of ideological falsity aggravated by vulnerability of elderly victims as typified in the elderly statute, while Claudio was accused of co-authorship of mentioned crimes plus illegal practice of the legal profession because, although formally licensed by the Brazilian Bar Association, he exclusively used specialized technical legal knowledge for criminal purposes, fundamentally violating professional deontological ethical codes established regulating honest, upright advocacy practice committed to justice. Instead of facilitating lucrative crimes through privileged knowledge of strategically exploitable legal systems' bureaucratic procedures, the criminal trial transpired dramatically over 13 days of public hearings widely covered by local regional press, transforming the emblematically nationally discussed case into television, legal programs, podcasts specializing in financial crimes, investigative blogs dedicated to exposing increasingly common succession frauds in demographically rapidly aging Brazilian society, with alarming statistical projections indicating that by 2050, approximately 30% of the national population will be aged over 65 years, creating exponentially expanded opportunities for opportunistic scammers exploiting cognitive, emotional, financial vulnerabilities of this inadequately unprotected, growing elderly population with insufficient legislation and enforcement. The popular jury, composed of 7 ordinary citizens randomly selected from the Municipal Electoral Registry, deliberated only 3 hours and 17 minutes before returning a unanimous verdict convicting Deborah and Claudio Vol. Accusations presented by the state prosecution. The presiding trial judge pronounced an exemplary, severe condemnatory sentence intended to establish a strong dissuasive precedent. Deborah received a total accumulated sentence of 7 years and 4 months imprisonment in initially closed regime, with possibility of progression to semi-open regime after completing minimum 40% of sentence, demonstrating exemplary prison behavior and participation in educational vocational programs offered by the state penitentiary system, admittedly deficient, overcrowded, but theoretically committed to prisoner rehabilitation instead of purely retributive punishment. Claudio was sentenced to a slightly inferior sentence of 6 years and 8 months imprisonment, considering secondary auxiliary participation instead of direct protagonism in crimes primarily committed by Deborah, who effectively executed direct emotional psychological manipulations of vulnerable elderly victims, while he provided only necessary technical legal documentary support to jointly, coordinately planned frauds, but additionally suffered a permanent, devastating professional penalty through definitive disbarment determined by the Brazilian Bar Association Sectional Council after disciplinary ethical proceedings, concluding that judicially proven criminal conduct irreparably violated fundamental principles of upright, honest advocacy, permanently impossibilitating future exercise of the legal profession in any capacity, regardless of eventual complete criminal sentence fulfillment and subsequent social rehabilitation. The sentence additionally determined that both convicted should jointly, integrally reimburse all identified victims in complementary police investigations, including not only Patricia and me, but also family members of 3 previous victims, who were similarly defrauded through operationally identical schemes during a decade and a half of systemic criminal activities, financial compensations totaling conservatively $1,800,000 plus updated monetary corrections, accumulated legal interest since respective dates of original committed crimes. Astronomically impossible financial amount for both convicted to realistically gather, considering that their illicitly accumulated personal estate had been judicially blocked, completely seized, integrally destined partially to satisfy reparations owed to criminally injured victims. After the condemnatory sentence definitively transited to res judicata, exhorting all appellate possibilities in all superior instances of the state justice tribunal and federal superior justice court that denied merit to defensive appeals presented by Deborah and Claudio, grounded in technically sophisticated but substantially empty legal argumentations, considering the overwhelming robustness of incriminating evidence accumulated in extensive judicial proceedings. Both convicted were effectively arrested and conducted to geographically separate, distinct state penitentiary establishments to prevent communication and collaboration between co-defendants, potentially planning future justice obstruction strategies or attempts to intimidate cooperating witnesses and investigative authorities, pursuing other potential members of a broader criminal network not yet completely mapped and exhaustively investigated. Patricia and I finally definitively received, after 2.5 years of emotionally, financially draining, but ultimately profoundly, significantly transformative judicial battle transcending merely monetary estate recovery, fundamentally involving restoration of paternal memory, honor cruelly violated by calculating, unscrupulous criminals. Complete bank transfer corresponding to equal halves of the judicially revaluated paternal estate totaling $1,065,000 each after deduction of procedural costs, professional fees, expert investigative expenses, all already previously reimbursed according to original judicial determination, but finally definitively liquidated through forced judicial sale of the luxurious apartment where Deborah comfortably resided for years, parasitically exploiting Dad in liquidation of his technical consulting company acquired by an established professional competitor offering fair market price. More importantly, profoundly emotionally, significantly cathartic than substantial financial recovery was the definitive public judicial validation that Dad had not really voluntarily, deliberately disinherited his beloved biological daughters, capriciously favoring a superficially known recent spouse, contradicting his solidly established character over decades of close loving family relationship, but rather had been a tragic victim of sophisticated criminals exploiting cognitive emotional vulnerabilities during the final period of life, when he presented subtle signs of clinically undiagnosed, but retrospectively behaviorally identifiable, mental decline by attentive, observant, close people. Complete vindication of his memory and reputation restored the honor temporarily stained by false narratives initially promoted by Deborah and Claudio, attempting to preventively discredit strategically anticipated family contestations. We used significant portions of the justly, deservedly recovered inheritance to establish a permanent memorial charitable foundation honoring Dad's memory and professional legacy, dedicated to financing complete scholarships for architecture and civil engineering students from low-income families demonstrating exceptional academic merit and promising technical talent, but lacking necessary financial resources to complete quality university education, adequately preparing them for socially contributive, successful professional careers. This perpetual philanthropic initiative, guaranteeing that the fundamental values of professional integrity, family dedication, and technical perfectionism that Dad consistently exhibited throughout his entire life would continue positively inspiring future generations of aspiring young professionals, literally and figuratively building the nations progressively developed physical and social infrastructures. Additionally, I became an active, dedicated volunteer for organizations protecting vulnerable elderly people's rights, delivering free public lectures to elderly residential communities, support groups, and family caregivers, specifically alerting about identifying signs of increasingly sophisticated prevalent succession frauds in contemporary society, generously, painfully sharing my personal family story, objectively aiming to preventively educate other potentially vulnerable families to recognize suspicious predatory behavioral patterns before similar devastating tragedies occur, irreversibly destroying family relationships, interpersonal trust, and financial security laboriously conquered over decades of dedicated hard work, transforming deep personal trauma into proactively, collectively beneficial social advocacy. Patricia similarly transformatively, productively channeled traumatic experience by establishing within the university hospital where she works a specialized screening triage program identifying early elderly patients presenting initial signs of cognitive decline and dementia, immediately connecting them to family support services, legal counseling, and preventive estate protection before progressive cognitive vulnerabilities are maliciously exploited by opportunistic predators, patiently, calculatedly, observing awaiting critical moments of potential victim fragility to maximize probabilities of elaborate, coordinately, systematically planned financial scam success. Early proactive medical intervention, potentially preventing hundreds or thousands of succession fraud cases annually estimated to occur nationally, but chronically underreported because victims and families frequently feel shame admitting publicly having been innocently deceived or completely lack knowledge of available legal contestation rights. Retrospectively reflecting on the complete journey from that rainy Tuesday afternoon receiving Deborah's devastating call informing of Dad's sudden death, the final definitive condemnatory sentence publicly judicially validating initial instinctive intuitions that something was fundamentally wrong and implausible with alleged testamentary provisions, I deeply recognize permanent personal transformations resulting from this traumatic but ultimately strengthening experience. I viscerally learned the important lesson that justice, although frequently slow, bureaucratic, frustratingly procedural, eventually prevails when determined victims courageously, relentlessly persist regardless of temporarily discouraging obstacles, methodically, patiently accumulating irrefutable, objective evidence confronting calculated lies and falsifications with scientifically verifiable documented truths. I additionally learned that fundamental human vulnerability transcends intelligence, education, and socioeconomic status, because even brilliant, successful people like Dad can be effectively manipulated by skillful, sociopathic predators exploiting universal basic emotional needs for romantic companionship, affective validation, and existential meaning, particularly acute during life transition periods like recent widowhood, professional retirement, growing loneliness, and inevitable aging. This humanizing recognition that fraud victims aren't stupid, naive, culpable, deserving of exploitation, but rather normal human beings facing difficult circumstances, making them temporarily susceptible to sophisticated psychological manipulations, executed by experienced professional criminals perfecting exploitation techniques, through multiple previous victims, empirically learning what effectively works to deceive fundamentally honest, trusting people erroneously, presuming that other people similarly operate according to basic ethical principles of fundamental decency. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, profoundly, I learned that genuine family relationships solidly constructed over decades of shared experiences and mutual unconditional love represent infinitely more valuable precious patrimony than any monetary, material, financial assets, because during the darkest, most desperate period of this traumatic journey, when it seemed justice would never be achieved and Dad's memory would remain permanently stained by criminal false narratives, it was the unwavering fraternal connection with Patricia, mutually supporting and persistently encouraging, that provided the emotional strength and psychological resilience necessary to continue courageously fighting when it would have been much easier and convenient to simply resignedly accept apparent injustice, moving forward with separate lives, avoiding the prolonged, painful confrontation required to seek deserved truth and justice. Today, 5 years and 2 months after the rainy, melancholy funeral where we buried Dad's physical body but not his memory and legacy, I live in peace knowing we fought well and honorably for his justice, that criminals were appropriately legally held accountable for crimes coldly, calculatedly committed, that his memory and reputation were completely publicly restored and judicially vindicated, that the estate laboriously constructed during 42 years of dedicated career is being productively utilized to perpetuate the fundamental values he consistently exemplified throughout his entire life through the Educational Memorial Foundation, positively impacting hundreds of promising young lives annually. This final alchemical transformation, converting devastating personal tragedy into lasting positive social legacy, transcending individual mortality, achieving symbolic immortality through continued beneficial influences on indefinite future generations.